Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this video is supposed to be a masterclass in Ruby classes. So kind of like I just did with Ruby functions, I'm doing this. The idea here is to cover lots of the features for classes in Ruby. At the same time, it's just a good review for me because I've been spending the weekend just doing sort of reviewing myself with Ruby because I'm constantly switching languages, so I got to do these review sessions to keep myself straight between all these languages. Okay, so if you've been watching my videos, you know what a class is. Again, a class is just a way we construct objects in a programming language. Okay, in what's called object-oriented programming. So the idea is that we are encapsulating what something is. So for example, a dog. So if I want to create the definition of a dog, I'm going to create a new class. And I'll use the class keyword and I'll say class dog. Okay. Now in Ruby, again, there's no curly brackets, so at least not in the traditional way. So I was just about to put some in there because I'm so used to JavaScript, but again, everything is, a block. So basically we all have the keyword and then the end keyword that basically declares that that block is done. So if everything in here is the definition of what a dog is. Okay, and let's start off really simple. That's it, that's all we need. We now have the ability to create a dog. So we'll say, hey, I have a dog named Spot, which equals dog.new. Okay, so now if I were to put Spot, okay, just sit there and say, okay, what is Spot? Let's see what we get. Okay, Ruby test.rb. Okay, and see we have an object that's called dog, and that's just the memory address of where that dog exists in the computer's memory. Okay, cool. So the dog object exists. We were able to create a dog object. And we can create multiple dog objects. Okay, so we'll say we also have Fluffy, who also equals another dog. Okay, now let's put Fluffy onto the console. Okay, and see, they're two unique dog objects. So you see the address here is a little bit different than the address here. They're two different dogs located in two different spots of memory. They're what's referred to as an instance. Okay, so this is the dog blueprint, and we're saying we're creating a new dog from this blueprint. Okay, that's essentially what how to think about a class. But a dog's not just a blank thing. A dog has properties, which are the things you use to describe the dog. Okay, and has methods, the things that the dog do, which are functions. Okay, so if we want to define the initial properties of the dog, usually you want to do that in the constructor of a function, a constructor of a class in any programming language. The constructor in Ruby is a function called initialize. So we're going to define a function called initialize. Okay, and we're just going to say we have some properties like legs. So we'll say dogs have 4 legs, at ears. So dogs have 2 ears, and tail, yes, a true. Dogs have a tail. Okay, and then we define that block is done. So, and put the end keyword there. Okay, cool. So now we have a dog. The problem is, if I want to access these properties in Ruby, these are referred to as instance properties. So each individual dog has their own legs, their own ears, their own tail. But I can't see them because they're all by default private. Okay, so I can't do this. I can't be like Spot dot legs. Okay, I can't do that. Okay, I can't do this. It's going to give me an error. Okay, see, unexpected instance variable. They just can't do that outside. Okay, or I can't do this. Spot.legs, Fluffy.legs, that's not going to work either. Okay, it's like, hey, there's no method here. It's expecting it to be a function. So we have to define what's called a getter and setter function. Okay, if we want to, you don't have to, but if you want to be able to get and set the value, you have to do that in Ruby. So right now, let's just worry about legs. So let's do that. So you would just define a function, legs, and all this function does is return legs. Just returns the value of that property. Okay, so now that's going to work because when I call legs, it's going to call this function legs, that returns the value of legs. So now, see, they both have 4 legs. Okay, but let's say something happens to Spot. He gets hit by a car and loses a leg. I have to have a way to change the leg. So I have to define a setter. So define set legs. Okay, and we'll pass a, an argument called value. And here what we're going to do is we're going to say at legs equals value. Okay, and then this should be def because we're defining the function. And then we end that function. Cool. Okay, so now I can be like, okay, Fluffy has 4 legs, but then Fluffy gets hit by a car, and I know that sounds sad, but the point is to, you want to imagine it in sort of how this relates to sort of real world objects to understand why you need to do these things. So Fluffy dot set legs. Now Fluffy has 3 legs. So now when we print out Fluffy's legs, we'll see that it turns into 3 legs. So let's run the code again and see Fluffy has 3 legs. Okay, cool. Now our constructor can take arguments. So let's say we want the dogs to have a name property. Okay, now I can do something like this. Add name equals name. Okay, and see, without the at symbol, they're referred to as a local variable. So it's local to the function. So if I want it to belong to each individual dog, I need 1 at symbol. Okay, cool. So now I can specify a name for these dogs. So dogs new, and this one's Spot. And this one is going to be Fluffy. Now let's get Fluffy's name. Okay, but we need a getter for Fluffy's name. So def name end. And I do find having to define every setter kind of annoying, but it's just something you have to do in Ruby. Not the worst thing in the world. Again, it's always not bad to kind of assume private until necessary. It just makes you're not exposing as much publicly of your class that way, versus like JavaScript where everything is just public and assuming public, and it's only till recently you could even define something as private. So everything was always kind of exposed and people could just do whatever they wanted with. But let's see here. Okay, so now these have a name. Okay, now we're going to actually print their names. So let's not worry about the legs. Let's print their names. Okay. Let's see, Spot and Fluffy. Okay, and see, Spot's name is different than Fluffy's name. So it's the same name of the property, but again, this is an instance property. So the instance of Spot has a separate set of variables in the instance of Fluffy. Okay, that's what we mean by instance variables. Each individual dog has its own name, its own set of legs, its own set of ears, and a tail. Now, what if we wanted to kind of have variables that are available to all dogs? Like maybe we want to keep track of the number of dogs. That's when we create class variables. So I might create something like this. Okay, and you use 2 at symbols. Okay, so at total dogs. Okay, and we'll say equals 0. And now every time we create a new dogs, we'll say at total dogs plus equals 1. Okay, so we're going to add 1 to total dogs. Okay. So now if I do this, puts dog dot total dogs. Okay, let's see that. Not sure if class variables are public, but let's find out. At total dogs. No, I gotta define a method for that too. Okay. So what I need to do is define a class method. So I could do it as an instance method, meaning the way I've done here. But if I want to define a class method, meaning a method that belongs to dog, not to the individual dog, I could do this. I could do def dog dot total. And then what this is going to return is just at total dogs. And that's it. Okay, end. So now I should be able to do dogs.total, and it should return to me the total number of dogs. So since we created Spot and Fluffy here, I should have 2 dogs total. Let's see if that works. Yep, and see, there we go. We got total dogs. And see, I'm calling, this is referred to, in other languages referred to as a static function, and here is referred to as a class function. See, it belongs in the class. You call it on the class. And the reason is that in Ruby, the class is in itself an object. That's why you call the property like this. You don't use a new keyword beforehand, because you're not necessarily invoking a function that constructs a thing. There's an object that has a function that constructs other things. So essentially every class is essentially a factory, or an instance of a factory pattern, in a sense. Okay, puts dog total. Cool. Isn't that neat? Okay, so we can create functions that belong to the class, not just to the instance of the class. Again, the difference is I have to specify that by putting like dog.total. Now, I could actually have it where that function runs right away. Okay, basically this is a function that runs, this class definition. It's all part of the new function. So what I could do, if I put like, let's say I just wrote here, puts, hey, this runs. This will actually run every time we create a dog. Okay, so watch what happens. Even though it's just like in the middle of my class definition, it will run. See, this runs. Okay, because it runs when it reads the definition of the class. It's only reading the definition of the class once. That's why it only runs once. So it's not redoing this each time I create a dog. It's reading this and running this when it creates the dog object, the object that will create the instance of dog objects. This is important because if later on you learn Ruby on Rails has all these macros that seem like magical, that just magically work. Really all they are class functions. So def dog dot, stuff. Okay, all we're gonna do is say, hey, puts, look, I ran. Okay, so this is a class function. So one way I could call it was like this. Self dot, because self refers to the class. This technically always refers to the instance. So self dot stuff is referring to that method. And if I do that, it's going to run this method down here. Okay, let's just confirm that. Undefined method stuff. Okay, because this is before the definition. I think if I put it down here, it should work. Control X. Because what happens is that in the reason why it works right away inside Ruby on Rails is because you're inheriting from the you're inheriting it. So let's see what happens if I put it down there. See here, and see there it works. See, because it's after the definition. Okay. And the thing is that you don't even need the word self. So if you don't need the word self, okay, then I can do that and watch, it still works. Look, I ran. Okay, and then let's say that stuff takes an argument. So my arg. Okay, and then that my arg is what gets put. Okay, now I pass in a symbol. A thing. Okay, so now this is going to really look like those macros inside Ruby on Rails. So all we're really doing is just passing a thing, which is just, again, a symbol is just basically like it works like a string, except it doesn't, every time you use a string, it creates a separate like string object in memory. But when you use a symbol, I can use the same word over and over again. It's only creating that one object in memory. So that way you're not using up as many memory when you need to refer to like the same word again and again. So stuff, a thing, and watch if I do this. See, a thing. It puts a thing. It's going to treat this essentially like a string when I go put it. Okay, so I'm just passing this symbol into the function of stuff. Okay, so that's kind of how it is. But again, in Ruby on Rails, you're generally inheriting And what does inheriting mean? That means you're creating a class based on another class. So let's say I did that. Let's say I created class small dog, which is inheriting. We use this symbol to inherit. So basically, it's inheriting from dog. Okay, so small dog is an extension of dog. And now I can go here and I can write stuff, a thing. Because stuff was already defined in dog, so when small dog comes around, it's available. And see, now that looks like those macros in Ruby on Rails. Neat. So again, just so that way when you see that, when you do Ruby on Rails, which if you're in Ruby, you're inevitably going to see, you realize you're just passing symbols into functions that were predefined in the parent class. That's literally all that's going on. Nothing more magical than that. But yeah, so basically here I can define more functions and create a new constructor, do whatever, everything you did in the parent class, except you already have access to everything in the parent class. So if I were to change this to small dog, okay, they're still going to have access to the everything is still going to work out the same way as it did before. See, it's still a thing still ran here because stuff still got passed in when it read the small dog object. So when it read when it created the class object of small dog, it still ran this function, and it got this function because it's inheriting it from dog. It sees the function over here defined, where is it here, and runs it and passes that symbol into it. But see, small dog, even though I didn't define any functions inside small dog, it still had access to name and total. I mean, particularly name, because it inherits all these functions from the parent. And see, even though I created two small dogs, it's still added to the dog total, the class property from dog. Okay? And then I think it should still work even if I change the name of the class. Let's try that out. Yep. It still works. Okay? So what happens is that this becomes sort of a property that exists between the class and all of its children and child classes. I think that was a pretty good deep dive into classes in Ruby. So again, just to kind of recap, we have instance variables, that's one @ symbol. You have class variables, which are two @ symbols. Okay, when you define a function like this, it is an instance function, which are public. Again, but by default, instance variables are private, so you have to define getter and setter functions like legs and name. Okay, and then if you want to define class functions or methods, you have to use the class name dot the name of the function when you define it. And again, when you do this, it's always going to assume that you're trying to run some sort of class function. So it's looking for, dog dot stuff here. Okay, so yeah, that was a lot. So you might want to watch this video once or twice to really kind of appreciate everything that just went on. But if you appreciate all this, making classes in Ruby will be a lot easier. Understanding what's going on in Ruby on Rails will be a lot clearer. I know for me, looking at all these macros, it just was magic. Oh, they just worked. How magical. But once you kind of understand the way classes work in Ruby, it becomes a lot less magical, and it makes it much easier to work with Ruby on Rails because you understand where the syntax is coming from. You understand kind of how they constructed it. So my name is Alex Merced. Have a great day and enjoy.